Jack Anderson, author of Washington Money Go Round. What is the money go round?
Well, the money go round is what happens to your money and my money when we give it to the federal government. The most inefficient way to spend our money is to let the federal government spend it for us. They will misspend it. They will buy the wrong things. They will use it principally for the care and feeding of bureaucrats.
Let me go through a couple of numbers that you refer to very early in the book. You talk about General George Washington spending $8,000 on 5 top horses, which would be equivalent today to about $400,000. Spending about $500 for haircuts a year, which would be equivalent to about $24,000. And from August of 1775 until March of 1776, spending about $6,000 for alcohol, again today equivalent to about $310,000. Why did you put that in the book? Why is that important?
I put it in the book because it's so typical of the bureaucracy and it's so typical of politicians from the very beginning. Going back to George Washington, he promised to serve the country at no salary. So he received no salary, but he turned in an enormous expense account. And we just found those records, and I thought that they were fascinating. So I, for historical reasons, went back to George Washington's time to show that this is the way it's been working all the time.
Where did you get the information?
Oh, we got it out of some historical documents.
What's corporate welfare?
Well, corporate welfare is benefits that the big corporations get at the expense of the taxpayers. These are research that is done by the government for the benefit of big business. You take the oil industry. The oil industry has been heavily subsidized, or at least indirectly, by the government. We're now in great trouble in Iraq. For a long time, our embassy in Iraq was really an outpost for big corporations that were doing business with Saddam Hussein. They had a committee. They called it the American-Iraqi Committee. It was a committee that did business personally with Saddam Hussein. It's the reason Saddam Hussein felt that he was free to invade Kuwait. He didn't think the Americans would interfere because he was giving so many good business deals to Americans. And they were taking advantage of it, and they were using the government to get those deals.
You talk about this in the chapter called Wall Street Welfare. Page 91, you say farm subsidies grew out of the muddle-headed notion that farmers are a special class that cannot be expected to suffer from the same business losses as the average entrepreneur.
That's right.
Explain.
Well, they felt that they were entitled to subsidies. It's basically different industries, the farmers being probably among the worst, have felt entitled to be subsidized, to have entitlements that we don't hear about, we don't know about. It's like everything with the federal government. Everything with the federal government is so screwed up that we have no records that we can really get to the bottom of it. Take taxes. We are spending, you and I, about half of our income on the government. About half of our income goes to pay taxes. But to find out how it's being spent is impossible because there are so many hidden taxes. There are local taxes, there are state taxes, there are county taxes, there are city taxes, there are taxes on gasoline, there are, of course, federal taxes and income taxes. And so we don't realize as we're paying all these taxes just how much in taxes we're paying. We don't know how our money is being spent when it is spent. Over at the White House, for example, we get a budget from the president. The budget from the president isn't honest at all. It doesn't come close to being honest because most of his expenses are charged up to other government agencies. The Park Service mows his lawn. The Defense Department does most of his chores for him, handles most of the White House expenses for him. And it's charged to their budget, not to the White House budget, so the White House budget is a dishonest budget. They have ways of hiding things. Take welfare. Welfare, people complain that the welfare payments are not high, but every government agency is engaged in the welfare program because the government requires, through laws and regulations, requires that each government agency devote part of their money to the high equal opportunity, for example, and meeting so many other requirements that are really intended to benefit welfare and should be charged to welfare. I'm not opposed to these programs, mind you. I'm not opposed to social programs. I think they're very noble, but I think that the time has probably come when we ought to know what we're spending our money for. If it's welfare, it ought to be called welfare, and we ought to know that it's going for welfare. And we ought to know how much the bureaucracy is getting. The best of our calculations about when you spend money on welfare, about 30 cents goes to the real needy people. About 70 cents goes to the care and feeding of the bureaucrats.
Why do we have a bureaucracy?
Well, a bureaucracy is the curse, but the necessity of government. We could get along without the president for years at a time, and we have virtually, with some duds in the White House. We've gotten along fine without presidents. We could get along without Congress and probably be better off for the absence. But we can't get along 5 minutes without the bureaucracy, because bureaucracy does the chores for the federal government. Now, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, probably thinks that he's in charge, probably thinks that he's running the country. He is not. He is wrong. Congress probably thinks that they're making the laws. They're wrong, too. We're ruled by a dictator, a benevolent dictator, and its name is bureaucracy. And I had my cartoonist. I don't draw, but I brought along a cartoonist to show you who is running the show. This is the dictator of the United States, a benevolent dictator, a federal octopus, and in this case, he's doing the typical, one of the typical things that government does. He's pondering the eternal question, which end is up, and he's pointing in every different direction at the same time. This is the way the bureaucracy answers your questions, and they have these undulating, they have these octopus-like tentacles, these octopus-like arms, these undulating, weaving arms that pamper you and caress you and make you feel good, particularly those who are in power. And all the time, the bureaucracy feeds on greenbacks, gets most of the benefits. Now, the benefits in the welfare program, for example, they'd be outraged if I should make the public statement that I just made, saying that they get 70% of the money, 70 cents out of the welfare dollar, and the welfare recipient gets 30 cents. But it's true. It's hard to prove, but we've pretty well nailed it down. Now, they don't get it for administering the program. They get it for studying things. They have all kinds of bureaucratic projects that only the bureaucrats can do. So they wind up getting 70 cents out of the dollar. They study how hungry the poor are, for example. Well, the poor don't care to have their hunger studied. They know how hungry they are. They don't need a study of how hungry they are. They already know that. They would rather not eat paperwork. They'd rather eat food. And so they get less food, and they get more paperwork, and the paperwork requires our hiring more bureaucrats.
You spent some time talking about Medicare, a $200 billion budget annually now. It's been 30 years since we've seen Medicare instituted by President Johnson. What was it? What was the annual budget when it was first implemented in 1965?
I don't remember the figures exactly, but it just mushroomed, and it's become welfare for doctors. The doctors at first opposed it. As a matter of fact, I remember my outrage at finding the doctors teaming up with the tobacco industry to block Medicare because they thought it would be socialized medicine, and they were afraid of it. They tried to block it. It's turned out to be the biggest bonanza that they've ever gotten because they're able to charge their patients, those who have money. Those who didn't have money didn't pay them anyhow. Those who have money are still paying them as much as they ever paid them, and welfare is extra.
Where do you get your information? Who are your sources?
Well, interestingly enough, I've condemned the bureaucrats here, but the sources are bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats are, first of all, good Americans, and it's amazing how many of them dislike the system. and want to see the system change. They don't like the kind of activities, the kind of bureaucratic mess that they're involved in. It costs so much money. I walked over to, as you can see, I tremble a little bit. That is, well, the doctor says it's Parkinson's. I think it may be 50 years in Washington that caused it. But I stopped by NIH to see what they'd learned about Parkinson's. And I talked to one of the researchers over there, and he showed me a pencil. He said, "See this pencil?" He said, "This costs us 5 times more than I can buy the same pencil down at the pharmacy or at the drugstore in our mall." And it's the procedures that add so much money to the government bill. For example, we were outraged to discover, and we were the ones who discovered, that the Air Force was paying $7,500 to provide coffee machines in high-flying planes. Now, $7,500 sounded outrageous because at that time they could have bought one that the airlines used for $150. Why should they pay $7,500 for a coffee maker? Well, Lockheed took the blame for it because Lockheed had made the coffee maker. But I investigated it thoroughly and found out that, in fact, the Air Force had so many requirements, so many specifications, that it was actually a bargain. The Air Force required that this coffee maker survive, as I recall, 30 or 35 Gs. I mean, if there had been a crash, the coffee maker had been the only thing that survived. And this coffee maker had to meet all these specifications. And after they met all the government specifications, $7,500 was cheap. The question, it's the specifications, it's the process, it's the procedures, it's the paperwork that costs us so much money.
Why doesn't the system change?
It's never changed. It's never changed in the history of bureaucracies, going back to the Mamelukes in Egypt. They were hired to administer the government, to work. Actually, they were slaves, and they ended up as the new line of pharaohs, because the bureaucracy, in the end, turns out to be the dictator, because they know how to do things. This is what's happening in Russia today, in the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc countries. The communists are still running things because the communists ran the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is essential. It's essential to the everyday operation of a government.
Page 246, you talk about the imperial ex-presidency. What is it?
Well, as I remember, it's been a little while since I've written this, but as I remember, I was referring, of course, to the care and keeping of former presidents.
Well, some of the figures that you point out, that this year alone we'll spend $27 million to take care of our former presidents.
And their families.
And their families. And when Harry Truman left office, the annual budget for then former President Truman was about $64,000. So why has it increased over the last 40 years?
Because it's the nature of bureaucracy and the nature of government to increase everything. Why? It's just the way it operates. It's the way it. I remember fondly Harry Truman, after he left the White House, going back to the same house he had left when he came to Washington as a senator, the same house in Independence, Missouri. I remember pictures of him carrying his own baggage into the house. That hasn't happened since Harry Truman. They get so much money for staff. They get money for expenses. They get. They live high on the hog at our expense. They spend 4 years as president of the United States, or 8 years as president of the United States, and they retire in luxury.
Has anything surprised you in the last 50 years? Any more?
I would have to say it has not. It surprised when I first came to Washington as a young reporter 50 years ago. I was shocked. I came from the Salt Lake out in Utah, and I'd been brought up on the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and I had not been exposed to Washington, and I thought I thought these were big and important people who inhabited the marble halls here in Washington, and I was shocked at what I found out. And it's gotten worse since, I'm sorry to say. And I got over being shocked 50 years ago.
How many books have you written?
I haven't counted them, I've written I've written a good dozen, maybe a little more than a dozen. Mostly, I've done a few books on fiction. I'm working on one now. I'm working on my memoirs now. Parkinson's causes you to shake a bit physically, but you're not as articulate as you used to be. It's not that the thoughts aren't there. It's not that you're unable to put them down on paper. It's that your muscles tighten and your tongue doesn't work the way it used to be. And so you're not as articulate as you used to be, but the one thing I can still do is write, so that's what I do. Much slower. I use a PC now, and the PC, I get too many L's and too many Z's, and I don't type as fast as I used to. But I'm working on my memoirs now. And
where do you do that? In your home, in your office?
At home. I run into the office on a pretty regular basis. I have a fax there, and they send me the column, and I look it over. They basically write it. They basically do the reporting. I'm talking about my staff. And then I'm chairman of Citizens Against Government Waste. That's the reason that I did this Washington Money Go Round book, is to expose the horrendous waste of the taxpayers' money. As I said at the beginning of the show, the most inefficient way that you can accomplish anything, whatever it is you wish to accomplish, is to let the federal government do it. It's the most inefficient way to do it. So anything we can do without letting the federal government spend our money on projects that somebody else could handle cheaper, we ought to let somebody else handle it.
Is there something in particular, or a column that you've written in particular, that you're most proud of over the years that you've done this?
Well, I always hope that it's the column that I'm working on. The hardest one, I guess, the most difficult one for me to crack was the fact that the CIA had hired mobsters, mafia mobsters, to attempt to bump off Fidel Castro. In order to get that story, I had to get the two most tight-lipped organizations in the United States to talk to me. I had to get CIA agents and mafia mobsters. And after about 5 years, I actually was able to get both. I heard from the mobsters. I got them to talk to me. One who did talk to me was executed for doing it. When I say that he was executed for talking to me, I'm just reporting what the detectives told me. The detectives came. His body was found washed ashore in Miami Beach. It was in a metal barrel wrapped in chains. I got a call from a couple of detectives in Miami asking if they could come see me, and I said, sure, come along, come anytime. And they showed up, and they said, we heard from our sources in the mob that he was executed for talking to you. Did this man never talk to you? And I said, well, I guess it's all right to say so now. It's too late for him to be harmed by it. Yes, he did. He told me a lot about it took me a long time to get him to talk to me, but he came to trust me, and he did talk to me. And I never betrayed his trust, but I guess somehow the mob found out about it. And they said, we hear is the reason he was executed. So I doubt that they would have executed him for lying to me. He wouldn't have been a good witness before the courts because he was a mafia mobster. He wouldn't have had any credibility in our courts. But I never caught him lying to me. I was able to prove about 80% of the things that he told me. I have to believe the other 20%. I don't think the mob would have killed him for lying to me. I don't think they would have cared if he had lied to me. They probably killed him for telling me the truth. So, yeah, I was able to break that story. And I had a terrible time getting the CIA to confirm it. But on a confidential basis, I got two of the CIA agents who were involved to talk to me about it. And they confirmed what the mobsters had told me. It took 5 years, and it was a tough story. I was working on it the whole 5 years. Not full time, but I was working on it the whole 5 years. It took a long time to break it.
Did you always want to do investigative journalism?
Well, I always thought journalism was investigative journalism. I didn't realize that I was the only pariah in town until I arrived here.
Why do you call yourself a pariah?
Well, when I arrived, we were about Drew Pearson, my predecessor and employer at the time, was probably the only investigative reporter in Washington. This was before, of course, this was before Watergate, and after Watergate, everybody wanted to be an investigative reporter and be played in the movies by Robert Redford. But before Watergate, we were pretty rare birds. In those days, reporters pretty much reported what the government wanted them to write. Now, I don't mean that they didn't expose scandals. They did, but they were usually scandals that one agency of government would want to expose in another agency of government. In other words, the feuds between government agencies, the State Department and the Defense Department, for example, would be reported by the reporters who were covering the State Department and the Defense Department. Those reporters covering the State Department would come home at night wearing tweed jackets, puffing on pipes. Those who covered the Pentagon would come home at night looking like they'd just gotten home from maneuvers. They tended to adopt the ideas, the attitudes of the people that they wrote about. We were the only ones, just about the only ones, that just tried to find out what was really happening as opposed to what these people told us was happening.
Who has influenced you the most?
Well, of course, without any question, the biggest influence on my professional career was the late Drew Pearson. He understood Washington, and I didn't. I came from the Salt Lakes. I came from Salt Lake City. I came from out in Utah, from behind the Wasatch Mountains, and I knew nothing about Washington. What I learned about Washington, he taught me. Drew Pearson, all I can say about the late Drew Pearson was that he was the most courageous man I ever knew. Nothing deterred him from telling the truth as he saw it. Now, he tended to see it from a biased point of view. I'll acknowledge that. But he was sincere. He believed in what he was reporting. And he stuck to his guns, and nobody could dissuade him, and nobody could frighten him. He would be sued. No lawsuit would scare him off. He would go ahead with the story. And he knew the back rooms of Washington. He knew the back alleys of Washington, and he taught me how to find my way around in the back alleys and the back rooms.
And how do you do that?
Well, basically, you can't trust, contrary to the popular impression that you have to name your sources. No source that you name is going to tell you the truth. Anybody who is identified is going to say what he wants or she wants you to know, or what his or her boss wants you to know. They're not going to tell you the truth. The only sources that are worth a damn are confidential sources. If I quote some White House aide, what is he going to tell me about President Clinton? He's going to tell me good things about President Clinton. Well, everything that happens at the White House may not be good. My job is to find out not only the good, but the bad as well. Let's find out what Clinton is really doing. The only way you're going to get that is from confidential sources. And the way you get that is not from politicians. Politicians tell you what politicians want you to hear. You've got to find it out from people beneath the politicians. The people beneath the politicians are the professionals. They're the ones who tell the politicians what's happening. So I tried to intercept the news at the bureaucratic level. That's why I said earlier, the bureaucrats are my friends. They're the professionals. And they're the people that I go to for my information.
Has Jack Anderson influenced Washington, influenced public policy in this country and in this town?
Well, that's not my job. My job is to report what's happening as honestly and fairly as I can.
But has that reporting led to any changes or led to any legislation?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, considerable. I've had a lot of bills introduced based upon stories that I've written. Not to say that they wouldn't have been introduced anyhow, that somebody else might have stumbled onto those same stories, or that the people in Congress would have learned that some wrongs had to be corrected. But I've set many wrongs right. I've had reporters, for example, I had a reporter go down and live as a migrant worker. He was emaciated in the first place, so it was easy to get him recruited. And he went down and lived the life of a migrant worker, came back and wrote the story, and it resulted in some dramatic legislation. I had the same reporter, as a matter of fact, go to get a job on the Alaska pipeline, and he found out that they were using faulty nuts and bolts and so in a stretch of the pipeline. They had to dig up that pipeline again because in that frozen tundra, hot oil seeping out could have ruined the environment. We've done a lot of stories of that kind, yes.
And finally, had you not gone into this profession, what would you have done with your life? Have you ever given that thought?
I knew when I was 12 years old that this was a profession that I wanted to spend my life at. I learned as a Boy Scout when I was 12 years old how to write stories. I was editor of a Boy Scout page in the Deseret News, that's the Salt Lake City newspaper. And in the summertime I worked for the Murray Eagle. I was a 12-year-old reporter for a weekly paper in south of Salt Lake City. It was called the Murray Eagle. First, I felt entitled to be subsidized, to have entitlements that we don't hear about, we don't know about. It's like everything with the federal government. Everything with the federal government is so screwed up that we have no records that we can really get to the bottom of it. Take taxes. We are spending, you and I, about half of our income on the government. About half of our income goes to pay taxes. But to find out how it's being spent is impossible because there are so many hidden taxes. There are local taxes, there are state taxes, there are county taxes, there are city taxes. There are taxes on gasoline. There are, of course, federal taxes and income tax. We got it out of some historical documents.
What's corporate welfare?
Well, corporate welfare is benefits that the big corporations get at the expense of the taxpayers. These are research that is done by the government for the benefit of big business. You take the oil industry. The oil industry has been heavily subsidized, or at least indirectly, by the government. We're now in great trouble in Iraq. For a long time, our embassy in Iraq was really an outpost for big corporations that were doing business with Saddam Hussein. They had a committee. They called it the American Iraq.
Jack Anderson, author of Washington Money Go Round. What is the money go round?
Well, the money go round is what happens to your money and my money when we give it to the federal government. The most inefficient way to spend our money is to let the federal government spend it for us. They will misspend it. They will buy the wrong things. They will use it principally for the care and feeding of bureaucrats.
Let me go through a couple of numbers that you refer to very early in the book. You talk about General George Washington spending $8,000 on 5 top horses, which would be equivalent today to about $400,000. Spending about $500 for haircuts a year, which would be equivalent to about $24,000. And from August of 1775 until March of 1776, spending about $6,000 for alcohol, again today equivalent to about $310,000. Why did you put that in the book? Why is that important?
I put it in the book because it's so typical of the bureaucracy and it's so typical of politicians from the very beginning. Going back to George Washington, he promised to serve the country at no salary. So he received no salary, but he turned in an enormous expense account. And we just found those records, and I thought that they were fascinating. So I, for historical reasons, went back to George Washington's time to show that this is the way it's been working all the time.
Where did you get the information?
The Iraqi committee. It was a committee that did business personally with Saddam Hussein. It's the reason Saddam Hussein felt that he was free to invade Kuwait. He didn't think the Americans would interfere because he was giving so many good business deals to Americans. And they were taking advantage of it, and they were using the government to get those deals.
You talk about this in the chapter called Wall Street Welfare, page 91. You say farm subsidies grew out of the muddle-headed notion that farmers are a special class that cannot be expected to suffer from the same business losses as the average entrepreneur.
That's right.
Explain.
Well, they felt they were entitled to subsidies. It's basically different industries, the farmers being probably among the